During and after the Second World War, there were many people who were executed for their terrible crimes and actions. The Allies and the Soviet Red Army would get their hands on a number of very powerful people, and they then, following trial, put them to death on the gallows and at the end of a firing squad. Men such as Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal, and Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, narrowly avoided the executioner's rope, choosing to die by their own hands, but these men were responsible for the deaths of millions of people. But there were many high-ranking Nazis who fell foul of their own evil actions, and some commandants were even executed inside their own concentration camps, and some incurred the wrath of the Führer following plots to bring his life to an end. In this documentary, we look at some of the top-ranking Nazis and how they were executed. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. To some people today, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was a skilled spy master who managed to build up an intelligence network to become a huge asset to Hitler and the Nazis, but to others he was a man who even witnessed many of the horrors and atrocities of the Second World War, and some even claim he may have been involved in them. He was someone who got the better of prominent Nazis such as Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, but he was also a man who could not be trusted, and he worked to subvert Hitler and the Nazi government. Wilhelm Canaris was born on the 1st of January 1887, and he would later join the Imperial German Navy and begin his naval training aboard the ship SMS Stein. He rose throughout the ranks of the Navy, and during the First World War he was serving as a naval intelligence officer. He saw action in a number of prominent battles, but managed to evade capture when his ship SMS Dresden was scuttled. He was a skilled member of the German intelligence network and was later sent to Spain to conduct reconnaissance on enemy shipping. He finished World War I as a U-boat commander, and his vessel was credited with a number of sinkings, and Canaris even became known to the Kaiser and was later awarded the Iron Cross First Class. He held many different positions and roles during the interwar period, from serving in different naval stations to even being sent to Japan to oversee the construction of secret U-boat programs that violated the Treaty of Versailles. But Canaris then became involved with the Nazis. He supported a return to a state-based authoritarian government, with a Führer to galvanise the nation, and he supported the fact that the Nazis planned on ripping up the Treaty of Versailles, which limited Germany heavily. Under Hitler's leadership, men like Canaris had a huge future, especially as Hitler planned to expand the armed forces. He also was attracted to anti-communism, and he once stated that we officers should always recognise that without the Führer and his Nazi party, the restoration of German military greatness and military strength would not have been possible. The officer's duty is to be a living example of National Socialism and make the German Wehrmacht reflect the fulfilment of National Socialist ideology. That must be our grand design. On the 1st of January 1935, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was made the head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency. He developed cordial relationships to begin with other high-ranking Nazis, even including the brutal butcher of Prague Reinhard Heydrich, who later turned on him, but Heydrich even became suspicious of Canaris later on, and told his men of the SD not to underestimate him. Canaris met with other agencies such as the Gestapo, and some claimed that in terms of his mentality, that he supported most of Hitler's views, and that he even suggested the use of the Star of David to identify Jewish people living inside of the Reich. But he then began to try and subvert Hitler and what his government were doing. He did not like Hitler's plans to invade and attack Czechoslovakia, and Canaris tried to keep the peace, and he even went to Franco in Spain to ask him not to allow German troops to pass through the land to capture Gibraltar and other lands. But as the Second World War broke out, Canaris's belief about the war and the Nazis began to shift dramatically. He was in Poland during one mass execution as SS troops pushed 200 Jewish civilians into a synagogue and then burned down the building to the ground, with every single victim dying in the attack. Canaris was appalled by this, and he was then sent to the front to watch the German army push forward, and he was told a great number of stories about massacre and execution. He even then went to Hitler's headquarters train, known as America, to complain about this, and he saw Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Armed Forces High Command, and stated, "I have information that mass executions are being planned in Poland, and that members of the Polish nobility and the clergy have been singled out for extermination, the world one day will hold the Wehrmacht responsible for these methods, since these are taking place under its nose. Keitel replied asking Canaris to just ignore it, as he did not want further attention being brought to it, but of course this sort of slaughter was the plan for the Nazis. Later the Vatican found out about the terrifying crimes being committed in Poland and the slaughter, and the information which was passed to the Pope was actually gathered by members of the Abwehr and agents, and Canaris had ordered them to collate this, and he then passed it on to leading Catholic figures, who sent it on to Rome. Canaris was now willingly resisting Hitler and passing information on to the authorities to cause further problems for the Nazis. He also dispatched a Catholic priest to meet with a different bishop from another country to discuss the atrocities which were being committed by the Nazis. Canaris was working to overthrow Hitler's regime actively, and he met with many other like-minded members of the military, and was also probably in contact with many enemy British agents. Canaris did during the war intervene to save a number of people from becoming a victim of Nazi persecution, and he managed to help 500 Dutch Jews get to safety in 1941, and some were even given false training as an Abwehr agent, which then allowed them to leave Germany and then get to safety. He was, however, growing more aware of a plot to assassinate Hitler, and he met with a number of the men who later carried out the July 20th plot, the failed assassination attempt on Hitler's life, as Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in a briefcase under a meeting table during a military briefing. This exploded and caused significant chaos and damage, but Hitler was injured and not killed. In the aftermath of this, there was a huge amount of arrest and execution, as Hitler ordered scores and scores of military officers of rank to be shot and hanged. Before this, evidence was growing about Admiral Canaris being a double agent, and Himmler pushed for Hitler to sack him and abolish the Abwehr in February 1944. Canaris was then placed under house arrest, and his final role was as the head of the Special Staff for Mercantile Warfare and Economic Combat Measures, which organised resistance to the Allied economic blockades of Germany. But following the July 20th plot, Canaris was arrested 3 days later, and he was accused of being the spiritual instigator of the plot. But no direct evidence linking him, the former head of the Abwehr, to the plot was ever discovered, but he was closely allied and associated with many of the other schemers. Canaris' imprisonment was rough and brutal, whilst investigations continued against him. He was confined in the Gestapo cellars of Prinz Albrechtstrasse, and was held in solitary confinement and was shackled in chains. It was stated that his cell door was left permanently open, and that it was kept lit all day and night. Canaris was also given 1/3 of the normal prison rations, and he was starved and suffered from the cold winter. He was forced to do menial tasks, such as scrubbing the floors of the prison, whilst the guards mocked him and taunted the former chief of the military intelligence service. His personal diary was given to Hitler in April 1945, and this implicated him in the plot to kill the Führer, and with this he was condemned to death by an SS summary court. Canaris was found guilty of treason, but in the months before this he had been sent to Flossenburg concentration camp, and he was treated also poorly here. He was beaten regularly by the guards, but on the 9th of April 1945, weeks before the war in Europe would come to an end and Hitler would take his life inside of his bunker in Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris' execution came. A prisoner claimed that on the night before his execution, Canaris tapped out a coded message on the wall of his cell, and that this said, "This is the end, badly mishandled, my nose broken. I've done nothing against Germany. If you survive, please tell my wife." His execution was one which aimed to humiliate and painfully bring the life of the former military intelligence chief to an end. He was ordered out of his prison cell and into the courtyard, where a hastily created gallows had been made. Usually at Flossenburg, soldiers of rank were executed by a firing squad, but this was not the case for Canaris, as he was to die a much more purposefully painful death. He was forced to remove all of his clothes, and was too alongside a number of other condemned men, including the priest Dietrich Bernhofer. The men were taunted by the SS guards, and Canaris was led up to the steps of the gallows in front of the jeering and laughing SS guards. An executioner took a noose in his hand and tied it around his neck, as Canaris was stood on a stool. The executioner then kicked out the stool from underneath him, and Canaris was left slowly strangling to death on the butcher's hook on the gallows. It's been claimed that his body was cut down a number of times, also to prolong the execution ordeal. His body was left to rot amongst many other condemned people's remains inside a Flossenburg concentration camp. One writer claimed later about Canaris' attitude that Canaris hated not only Hitler and Himmler, but the entire Nazi system as a political phenomenon. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. Everywhere he travelled at home and abroad and to the front, he always left a whirl of confusion behind him. In reality, this small, frail, and somewhat timid man was a vibrating bundle of nerves. Extremely well-read, ever-sensitive, Canaris was an outsider in every respect. In bearing and manner of work, he was the most unmilitary of persons. He was someone who subverted Hitler and the Nazis by passing on vital information to other nations and countries about their war crimes, and he knew that this could catch up with him one day and then bring his execution. Eventually the Nazis caught up with Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and he was executed in the final days of the Second World War in Europe, but was a broken man, and his treatment inside of prisons he had been held in was barbaric. Joachim von Ribbentrop was born in 1893 in Prussia, and as a child he was described by his teacher as the most stupid in his class, full of vanity and very pushy. His father was dismissed from the Prussian army after discussing rumours about Kaiser Wilhelm II, and because of this the family were rather poor. They then moved to Switzerland, but Joachim was taught by different tutors of different languages, and he even travelled to Britain for a year to improve his use of English. In 1911 he began working as a clerk for a German importing company based in London, and he then moved to Canada, being employed in various construction roles. As the First World War broke out, he returned to Germany and joined the German army. He saw action on the Eastern Front before going to the Western Front, and during his time in the army he was given the Iron Cross. After the war he met his wife and had 5 children. After he left the army, he worked as a salesman for the French champagne business Pommery in the Rhineland, and it was through this that he met Adolf Hitler for the first time. Von Ribbentrop was introduced to Hitler as a man who would get the same price for German champagne as others would get for the French champagne, and he was described as an astute businessman. He was bowled over by Hitler's presence, and he joined the Nazi Party officially on the 1st of May 1932, beginning his political career. He had a fear of communism and believed that the Nazis were the way to combat this. Ribbentrop was a man who was not trusted by the older members of the party, and he was disliked, but Hitler was fond of him and he would make time for him any time. Ribbentrop's political beliefs prior to joining the Nazi Party are questionable, as he was described as a man who had no political views, however did admire the recovery efforts of Gustav Stresemann, and he may have wanted to see the Kaiser return. Many who knew him would later be shocked at his link to the anti-Semitic Nazi Party, as before he showed no views that were anti-Jewish. He became a favourite of Hitler and a trusted advisor on foreign policy, but it was said that he didn't know anything about it, instead just wished to please Hitler. He was a bit of a yes-man, who would listen to Hitler and then tell him exactly what he wanted to hear. He arranged meetings with journalists and Hitler that would promote the future dictator's image. Ribbentrop quickly rose throughout the foreign ministry, to the point where he had a staff of around 300 people, and in August 1936 he became the ambassador to London. In this role he was tasked with keeping the British government sweet and convincing them not to become involved in German affairs, and in particular their disputes with regards to borders and territory. There was also an olive branch extended between the nations to work together against communism and the Soviet Union. He was famously known for making an embarrassing gaffe, greeting King George VI with a German Nazi salute, nearly knocking over the king. He also had SS guards stationed outside the German embassy in London, and had official cars flying swastikas, which caused a great degree of outrage in Britain. On the 4th of February 1938, he became Germany's foreign minister, replacing Konstantin von Neurath. He was described at the time by Hitler's secretary as a rather odd man, absent-minded and a cranky eccentric, but he worked closely with the Führer, negotiating with the French and British governments. It was looking likely that as Hitler's demands for land across Europe for his Reich increased, war would possibly be on the horizon. It was Ribbentrop's job to help keep the country sweet and to help get deals with territory, and he in August 1939 signed his most famous pact, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He had managed to obtain the Sudetenland for the Nazis, and this did not stop Hitler taking the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression pact between the surprising allies of the Soviet Union and the Nazis to guarantee peace. The agreement also organised the partition of Poland and how it would be split up between the two, and it should have been a pact that guaranteed 10 years of peace, but this would not last long. The deal that would carry his name was something Ribbentrop himself was very proud of. Within a year of signing, Hitler began to once again plot the invasion of the Soviet Union. He then sent his foreign minister to sign a new treaty and agreement with Japan to secure a further ally. In late September 1940, Ribbentrop informed the Soviet minister Molotov that Germany, Italy and Japan were forming an Axis alliance to be against the US and not the Soviets. As the Second World War erupted, he had a key role in dividing up and organising the annexation of many of the Balkan states into the Third Reich, and he helped to establish pro-Nazi states within these, for example choosing a Ustasha to rule over Croatia. Ribbentrop himself was opposed to Operation Barbarossa, but he and the Foreign Office began to develop a tense relationship with the SS. With regards to the Holocaust, the Foreign Office played an important role in organising the deportation of the Jews to the death camps. Ribbentrop passed a book with the Holocaust work, and ordered those below him to deal with it, but only once did he try and slow down deportations. He kept meeting with different foreign ministers as the Second World War continued, through to 1943, and he continued to work with the Nazi policies put in place. In particular, in April 1943, he met with the regent of Hungary and tried to convince him to deport all of Hungary's Jewish population straight to the death camps, and allegedly during the meeting showed his true colours, saying, "The Jews must be exterminated or taken to concentration camps. There is no other possibility." As the Second World War entered 1944, Ribbentrop's influence across Germany fell. As most of the world was at war with Germany, no one needed to meet with him or negotiate, as the focus came to defeating the Germans. Diplomatic relations that existed between Germany and many other countries across the world were now severed, and Hitler began to avoid his foreign minister, and he grew bored of him. Ribbentrop also at the time started conflict with other Nazis, but during the July 20th plot, much scrutiny was placed upon him. Many members of staff within the foreign ministry took part in the plan to blow up Hitler's Wolf's Lair or Rastenburg and kill Hitler, but Ribbentrop knew nothing about it. He did later work closely with the SS to punish those involved. However, Goering became furious at him, screaming that he was a dirty little champagne salesman. But as the Battle of Berlin took hold and the Red Army conquered large swathes of the city, Hitler took the easy way out inside his bunker, taking his own life. Von Ribbentrop tried to find a job under the new government, headed up by President Karl Dönitz, but he was rejected, and he then went into hiding under a false name, Herr Reiser. He stayed in Hamburg, and then after the Germans surrendered, he was arrested. He was seized by a French citizen, who was working for the British, and on his person was found a letter to Churchill, rambling about British foreign policy. He was then kept imprisoned until he was placed on trial at the Nuremberg Trials. After the Second World War, the remaining high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, including Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess and Ribbentrop, were placed on trial at Nuremberg, with the world keen to bring them to justice for their crimes of the conflict. Ribbentrop was to stand trial accused of 4 crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and deliberately planning and waging a war of aggression. Ribbentrop was found to have been involved in the organisation of the final solution, working out mass deportations within the Foreign Office, and also he ordered that the process of sending Jews to the death camps needed to be sped up. He also carried out other crimes and was held accountable for other atrocities that occurred during World War II. In his defence, Ribbentrop stated it wasn't him who made the big decisions, instead Hitler would do this and he had no choice. He also said that Hitler had deceived him with his initial views on peace, but this was clearly a lie. It was obvious that Joachim von Ribbentrop was close to the war effort and also the planning, and was integral with this as he was the foreign minister. He remained loyal to Hitler until the end, in prison saying, With all I know, if in this cell Hitler should come to me and say do this, I would still do it. He claimed at trial that he'd worked for 20 years of his life for an understanding between Germany, France and Britain, and wished to build an alliance between Germany and Britain, but this could not be achieved. For his crimes, Ribbentrop was sentenced to death. He was one of 10 men sentenced to death by the judges at the trial, including Hermann Göring. However, the former head of the Luftwaffe would escape his execution by taking his own life hours before. One of the key points about the Nuremberg executions is that they were not as clean as many thought, and they were botched by the infamous US executioner John C. Woods. Woods has gone down in history as being a man who did not perform his duty to the best of his ability that day when executing some of history's worst war criminals. Ribbentrop was the first of the men to be executed. Inside the gymnasium of the prison the condemned defendants were held in, a large scaffold had been created. Hitler's foreign minister made his way to the gallows first. He entered the gymnasium and climbed up the stairs of the gallows. He climbed the 14 steps escorted by the guards, and he was then asked for any final words. As a black hood was placed on his head, he stated, "God protect Germany. God have mercy on my soul. My final wish is that Germany should recover her unity, and that, for the sake of peace, there should be an understanding between East and West. I wish peace to the world." Ribbentrop then turned to the prison's priest who accompanied him and whispered to him, "I'll see you again." As the trapdoor fell open, von Ribbentrop, the man who was once the key foreign minister for the Third Reich, was left swinging from the noose for a long 14 minutes. It took him almost a quarter of an hour to die, writhing around and moaning in pain, as a drop had not been calculated correctly. Because of this, von Ribbentrop's spinal cord had not been severed, and instead he slowly strangled to death. Joachim von Ribbentrop was the champagne salesman who managed to charm Adolf Hitler, to the point where he rose incredibly sharply to the position of foreign minister. With Hitler's key ideas to expand the German Empire, Ribbentrop possibly had one of the most difficult and important roles in the whole of the Nazi hierarchy. He was a man who at times may not have wanted war with certain countries. However, ultimately he was a man who became ingrained with the horrific Nazi policies that brought so much suffering onto those across Europe. Von Ribbentrop is an interesting and divisive figure, who today is mostly associated with his actions pre-war, negotiating with different nations. He was a man who was devoted to Hitler, but by the end of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler had become tired of him. After the conflict, it was confirmed that he had a role in the Holocaust, and that Ribbentrop was responsible in the planning and waging of a war that killed millions across Europe.
Keitel was a man who was the chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the German military, and he was at the end of the conflict brought to the Nuremberg Trials alongside other prominent Nazis such as Rudolf Hss, Alfred Jodl and Hermann Göring. He was condemned for a number of different war crimes, but he was also a man who was very loyal to Adolf Hitler. Join us today as we look at the execution of Wilhelm Keitel, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. As a young man, Wilhelm Keitel was born into a comfortable household, and his father held a significant amount of land, but after finishing school he sought a career inside of the German military. He started off as an officer cadet inside the Prussian army, but was not allowed to join the cavalry because he was viewed as a commoner, so he had to settle in a field artillery regiment. As World War I broke out across Europe, Keitel was fighting in Flanders on the Western Front and in the trenches, but he was seriously injured when a shell fragment hit his arm, and he spent a period of time recovering. But more promotions came as he was made a captain, and at the end of the conflict he was a member of the Reichswehr, the Treaty of Versailles limiting German army, which was made up of initially only 100,000 soldiers. But Keitel was a man who also joined right-wing paramilitary groups, and he was a Freikorps member, who was not happy with the Weimar government and the aftermath of the First World War. He helped to organise the Freikorps and gained a lot of respect for this, and he later became a member of the Ministry of War in 1929, but when Hitler took control he was serving as a head of the organisational department of the military. Keitel was a man who was a key part of Hitler's plans, and he was someone who was very loyal to Hitler. Hitler wanted to rearm Germany in secret and build up its military might, ready for another world war, and Keitel helped in organising secret projects to build tanks and recruit forces into the army, breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He was later in 1939 made a Major General and was appointed the Chief of the Reich Ministry of War's Armed Forces Office. But Hitler in 1938 seized command of the German army, and Keitel was then given his highest ranking position, the Chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which made him practically the Minister of War, and he was now seen as the most senior soldier in Germany, and he was always at cabinet meetings with Hitler. But to many inside of Hitler's government, Wilhelm Keitel was nothing more than a yes-man, and someone who Hitler had control of. He was a puppet, and Keitel would do anything Hitler wanted, and he was actually seen as rather terrible at his job. Keitel was the Chief of Staff and Hitler's number 2 in the armed forces, and some even mocked him, calling him La Keitel, calling him nothing more than a lackey, and Goering even referred to him as a nodding donkey. Hitler would unleash some brutal tirades aimed at Keitel, and it was once said that he has the brains of a movie usher, but was made the highest ranking officer in the army, because the man is as loyal as a dog. Keitel, though, was the front of the German army's efforts during the Second World War, and he referred to Hitler as the greatest commander of all time when German forces powered through Poland and then into France. He was present in the negotiations regarding the French surrender, and Hitler would then turn his ideas towards the Soviet Union, and he planned Operation Barbarossa. In secret and in his mind, Wilhelm Keitel knew that this was possibly a step too far for the German army in 1941. However, he did not object to it, and also refused to hear anyone's concerns who voiced them. Hitler had overall say with the German military at the time, but Keitel would, as the war went on, continue to carry out whatever the dictator wanted. When a bomb exploded inside of Hitler's Wolfslayer headquarters, Wilhelm Keitel was put to work punishing those members of the military who had plotted the coup. This resulted in the executions of around 5,000 people. However, at the end of the conflict, he stayed close to Hitler in the Führer bunker and continued to be a part of the daily war briefings. At the end, he did decide to try and flee, and he managed to get to Flensburg to join up with the government headed up by the new president of Nazi Germany, Karl Dönitz, following Hitler's death. However, he was arrested days later, and he signed the German unconditional surrender. Keitel was then brought to the Nuremberg Trials, and it was said he had full understanding of the invasion of Poland, and also he knew much about the mass slaughter of civilians at the hands of the Einsatzgruppe inside occupied lands. Keitel's signature was also on a number of illegal documents, which gave permission for soldiers to execute prisoners of war without a trial. Keitel believed it was his job to rid the world of Bolshevism, and he ordered the executions of communists, and signed further decrees that allowed the killing of enemy commandos without trial too. Whilst at the Nuremberg Trials, he was indicted on all 4 counts and charges, and these illegal orders came back to haunt him. He knew that these were against the rules and laws of war, but he said he could not go against Hitler's wishes. He said at the trial that, as these atrocities developed one from the other, step by step, without any knowledge of the consequences, destiny took its tragic course with fateful consequence. Keitel knew what the sentence would be for him, and he would have preferred to have been executed by a firing squad as a member of the military, suffering a soldier's death, but this was not allowed, and Wilhelm Keitel was to be executed like a common criminal and murderer on the gallows alongside the other condemned defendants. The Nuremberg executions took place on the 16th of October 1946, and 10 executions took place early in the morning. The man who was carrying these out was John C. Woods, an American executioner, who is remembered in history for his botching work, and the Nuremberg executions certainly did not go well. The method Woods used was the standard drop method, but he was also having to work with a trapdoor that was not working well, and it was too small for someone to fall through without hitting the sides, and sometimes a trapdoor smashed a condemned on the head as they fell through. Wilhelm Keitel's execution was one of those that did not go well at all. He was executed second following Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, and he was the first military commander or leader to have been executed under the concept of international law, which brought professional soldiers to justice for their war crimes and actions. He walked into the execution chamber 2 minutes after von Ribbentrop had plunged through the trapdoor, and the body of the foreign minister was still writhing around behind the curtain on the first scaffold, and the tight rope could be seen. Keitel, when he entered the room, seemed rather relaxed to begin with, and witnesses claimed he had his head held high, whilst the executioner's assistant secured his hands together, and he confidently then strode towards the gallows. He confirmed his identity and then walked up the steps of the gallows, almost as if he was expecting to receive some form of salute from the guards. He did not need the assistance of the American guards and seemed to pride himself on going to his death all by himself. When prompted for any final words, Wilhelm Keitel stated that, "I call on Almighty God to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their deaths for the fatherland before me. I now follow my sons, all for Germany." After this, John C. Woods then placed a black cap over his head so he could not see what was happening. Then the noose was firmly secured around his neck. Woods positioned Keitel over the trapdoor. He then released this, and Keitel went through the trapdoor, but things noticeably did not go well. Keitel's neck was not snapped by the noose, and it took a staggering 24 minutes for him to die. As he fell through the trapdoor too, the door smashed him on the head, and he was left bleeding heavily from behind the curtain, and this was not intended. Keitel behind the curtain slowly strangled to death, and he was convulsing, but Woods then continued with the hangings, leaving Wilhelm Keitel to succumb to his arduous and lengthy fate. Woods, the executioner, later claimed that, "I hanged those 10 Nazis and I'm proud of it. I wasn't nervous. A fellow can't afford to have any nerves in this business. I want to put in a good word for those GIs who helped me. They all did swell. I'm trying to get them a promotion. The way I look at this hanging job, somebody has to do it. I got into it kind of by accident, years ago in the States." Woods showed little bother about these botches, and was more concerned that he executed the Nazis like Keitel, rather than the manner in which he did it. Wilhelm Keitel was a man who appeared to many as the most senior figure of the German army's command. However, he was simply a man who was just very loyal to Hitler, and who would carry out anything the dictator wanted. He was a soldier who flagrantly knew he was breaking laws and rules of war when he issued illegal orders, and he knew that his actions resulted in the executions and slaughter of thousands of people. But inside the execution chamber of Nuremberg prison, he experienced a horrific execution which did not go how it was intended to.
Kurt Daluege was born on the 15th of September 1897 in Kreuzberg, a town in Upper Silesia. Little is known about his early life. However, he began to serve inside of the Prussian army in 1916, and he saw service in the First World War. He first saw action on the Eastern Front before being fast-tracked to becoming an officer, and after his officer training, he was transferred across to the Western Front. During action here, he was badly injured in the head and shoulder, and during a stay in hospital, it was stated how he was 25% disabled, showing how he was suffering from his wounds. Following the war, he was decorated for bravery, but he also then began to work as an engineer, and he became rather political and joined a number of organisations. Daluege joined the Upper Silesian Self-Defence and became their leader. This was a group of veterans from the First World War who began to come into conflict with Polish people in the Upper Silesian region. While studying engineering in Berlin, he also became a member of the Freikorps, who were a group of veterans who were unhappy with the Weimar Republic, and the paramilitary group, who were often armed, served as a threat for the post-war German government. It was at this time that Adolf Hitler was conducting many speeches for the Nazi Party, and he became the leader in 1921. The Nazis' influence initially was small over Munich, but word of mouth would spread the party's support, and in 1923 Daluege joined the Nazi Party. Following the failed Munich Putsch of 1923, when Hitler tried to take control of Munich and get declared the President of Germany, the leader was thrown into prison for a short time, but Daluege was not put off, despite efforts to suppress the party. He became involved in the Berlin Fruchtbahn, a restructured organisation of the SA that had been banned following the putsch. In 1926, following the lifting of the SA's ban, Daluege joined and he became the leader of the Berlin SA detachments, and also became interlinked to the hierarchy of the Nazi Party. He also became the deputy for Joseph Goebbels, and with this he became rather popular. It's clear that Hitler must have valued him, as he was told to resign from the SA and to join the SS instead. This would prove to be a good decision, as 4 years later the SA would be purged, during the Night of the Long Knives, by the SS.
Inside of the SS, Kurt Daluege's responsibilities were to spy on the SA, report of any signs of discontent between the stormtroopers and the Nazi hierarchy, and also to keep a close eye on the political opponents of the Nazis, such as communists. He was involved in keeping the SA under control, as in August 1930, a Berlin SA leader organised a group of the Brown Shirts to attack the Berlin party headquarters of the Nazis, and the SS led by Daluege defended it, and this was celebrated by Hitler. He recognised Daluege in an open letter stating, "SS man, your honour is loyalty, my honour is loyalty," which became the SS slogan. He was then promoted and took control of the SS in northern Germany, with Himmler overseeing the southern units of the SS. With this, it's interesting to look at a comparison between Himmler and Daluege. Himmler later would become the Reichsführer SS, and arguably the most powerful man in Germany behind Hitler, but Daluege's reputation is less known. He continued to achieve more power in Germany, becoming a member of the Reichstag, and also he became the overseer and boss of the General der Polizei, the non-political police. During the Night of the Long Knives, the purge of the SA, Daluege was incredibly ruthless against his former allies and friends, and he considered them a threat to society. He began to transition the police institute to become a rather Nazi police, and began to instill the ideologies onto them. His influence grew, and eventually his power over the uniform police went from Prussia to the whole of Germany, meaning all forms of the police force, from the railway police to the Coast Guard to even the broadcasting police, fell under his leadership. He restructured many of the departments, and later Himmler appointed him the chief of the Orpo, the Ordnungspolizei, which cemented his position as being in charge of almost all of the uniformed police under Nazi lands. By the outbreak of the Second World War, he had control of around 120,000 active police officers, and they were not just your normal police officers, they were brutal and were known for violently policing the state. As the Second World War carried on, he continued to take an active role in brutal actions. In 1941 he was present in a number of mass shootings of Jews in Poland and in Belarus, and also he was involved in the deportation of Jews. He signed orders for Jews to be taken from Germany, Austria, and Bohemia and Moravia and moved into ghettos. He was also present during a conference where Himmler debated the idea of expanding Operation Reinhardt, the secret Nazi operation to murder Polish Jews in Poland and other lands that fell under the control of the Nazis. He evidently supported these policies and did not stop any of them. But it was inside of the Czech Republic that Daluege really showed his brutality. Following the assassination of the Reich protector for Bohemia and Moravia, the butcher of Prague Reinhard Heydrich, brutal reprisals were ordered by Hitler on the area. Daluege succeeded as the deputy protector in 1942, and Hitler had been persuaded by Himmler to put Daluege into this position. A state of emergency had been declared after Heydrich's death, and scores of people were executed in reprisals, even when the assassins had not been found. It was decided that revenge would be had on the area, and it was reported from Hitler that he commanded a huge number of brutal reprisals for any village found to have harboured Heydrich's assassins. These orders were to execute all adult men, transport women to concentration camps, gather up suitable children for them to be placed in SS families, and to finally burn down the village and level it. Daluege, along with SS officers, ordered the villages of Lidice and Lazaki to be razed to the ground, with these policies being brutally carried out. Inside of the villages, when the Nazis rolled in, there was complete terror. Lidice was chosen as its residents were accused of hiding partisans, and inside of them all of the men were rounded up and taken to a farm on the edge of the village. Mattresses were taken from the houses and were stood up against the wall of a barn to prevent bullets ricocheting off. The shooting began at 7 a.m. on the 10th of June 1942, with men being shot in groups of 5. This was deemed to be too slow, and then the firing squads began to shoot men in groups of 10. Only 3 male villagers survived. 203 women and 105 children were taken and transported to a nearby grammar school. Children were then taken from their mothers, and then the mothers were later loaded on trucks to be taken to concentration camps. Many of the children who were not chosen for Germanisation were sent to Helmno concentration camp, where over 80 were gassed inside of gas vans. The village was then burnt to the ground and the buildings were destroyed with explosives. Pets and working animals were also slaughtered, and the Germans even dug up the remains of those interred in the town's cemetery and even looted some of the remains for gold teeth. Lasaki was destroyed 2 weeks later when a radio transmitter belonging to the team who parachuted Heydrich's assassins were found. Daluege was ultimately brought into Czechoslovakia as a previous man, Hans Frank, had not carried out sufficient brutal reprisals, but Daluege was seen as a worthy sadist to complete the job. He continued in his roles until May 1943, when he suffered a huge heart attack and almost died. In the months after, he was relieved of his jobs and offices, and was gifted a large property by Hitler. However, in May 1945, Daluege was arrested by British soldiers in Lübeck, in northern Germany. He was then taken to Luxembourg before he was extradited to Czechoslovakia to be tried for the crimes against the people who he served in his role as protector. He was placed on trial for his crimes against humanity, and throughout the trial he was ignorant and said 3 million police officers venerated him. He claimed he was only following the orders of Hitler and said he committed no crimes. He was sentenced to death, being convicted of all charges. The day after his guilty verdict, he was executed by hanging. Inside of the walls of Pankrak prison in Prague, which during the Nazi occupation was a Gestapo investigation centre, he was executed. He was led out of the prison into a courtyard and outside where hundreds of spectators had gathered to witness Daluege's death. The crowd was made up of members of the public as well as guards, and when he was led out he was flanked by them. He was then led to the execution pole. He was not executed using a gallows or a trapdoor. This pole method was mostly used in Czechoslovakia, and it was where a rope was passed for a pulley at the bottom of the pole. Then the condemned was hoisted to the top of the pole by a sling running across their chests. A noose was then placed around Daluege's neck, and when the chest sling was released, he jerked downwards, and then his head was guided down by the executioner's own hand, and it dislocated the neck. Daluege suffered this fate, and there was a huge amount of people there to witness his death. His hanging and execution was performed efficiently, and within minutes of entering the prison yard, he was declared dead. Kurt Daluege was responsible for the massacres of hundreds during the Second World War, and the brutal reprisals following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. He is remembered as the chief of the uniformed order police that served the Nazi Party with ruthless efficiency, and worked with other guards to instill fear into the people. He was guilty of a number of crimes, but what's clear is that he had little remorse for his crimes, going to his execution as staunch a Nazi as he was when he was serving Hitler.
Rudolf Hss would join the Nazi Party in 1922, following hearing a speech from Hitler in Munich, and he would participate in brutal acts under the guise of the party. He would be part of a group who would beat a schoolteacher to death, who Martin Bormann wished dead, but Hss was tried as a ringleader and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was known for being a rather violent man, and after his release he married and had 5 children. Hss had become acquainted with Heinrich Himmler and joined the SS on the 1st of April 1934, moving to the Death's Head unit. Hss would idolise Himmler, and he even preferred the head of the SS to Hitler himself. Hss was first assigned to Dachau concentration camp in December 1934 and would work there as a block leader. After promotion within the SS to captain, he would become an adjutant to Hermann Baranowski at Sachsenhausen, who was involved in the leadership of the camp. At Sachsenhausen he would lead the firing squad, and it would be Hss who led the execution of August Dickmann, the first conscientious objector to be executed after the war began on the 15th of September 1939. Hss even fired the finishing deadly shot from his pistol. He would then transfer to the Waffen-SS in 1939 after the Germans invaded Poland, and he was rather thought of within this organisation and recommended for promotion. On the 1st of May 1940, Hss would begin the role in which he would be most famous for. He was appointed commandant of a prison camp in western Poland, and the camp had been built around an old army barracks and was named Auschwitz. Hss would go on to command the camp for 3 years, and he turned the camp into a huge expansive complex known as Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. He had been briefed to create a transition camp for 10,000 prisoners from the existing buildings, but he had different ideas. He wanted to create the most efficient camp he could, certainly more efficient than what he had seen in the past. Hss would even move into Auschwitz himself inside a villa, along with his wife and children,
and would, despite his horrific work in organising mass murder, live a relatively normal home life. Auschwitz at its peak would be made up of 3 different facilities, and it was served by many sub-camps. The whole camp was built on around 20,000 acres, with Auschwitz I being the main admin centre, Auschwitz II Birkenau being the extermination camp, and Auschwitz III Monowitz being the slave labour camp for German industrial conglomerates. Hss would secretly meet with Himmler in June 1941 after hearing about the order for the final solution. Himmler had chosen Hss's camp Auschwitz for the extermination of Europe's Jewish population due to its easy access by rail, and also because of the huge site that had been set up. The project was described as secret, and Hss began to develop and test different ways of massacring as many people as possible in the most efficient way. Auschwitz would become the most efficient instrument in the Holocaust, and the camp would develop further to become even more efficient in its method of killing. Hss would experiment with different methods of gassing prisoners in order to kill the most people as quick as he could, and during his reign as commandant he would oversee the deaths of hundreds of thousands. After his arrest he would state, "I myself never knew the total number, and I have nothing to help me arrive at an estimate. I can only remember the figures involved in the larger actions. From Upper Silesia and the general government 250,000, Germany 100,000, Holland 95,000, Belgium 20,000, France 110,000, Greece 65,000, Hungary 400,000, and Slovakia 90,000. This brings his total of killings to 1.1 million. He would then say, "I can no longer remember the figures for the smaller actions. I regard a total of 2.5 million deaths as far too high. Even Auschwitz had its limits to its destructive capabilities." Hss would be removed from Auschwitz in 1943 after he had an affair with an inmate, and this could have resulted in him being relieved from command. He would return on the 8th of May 1944 to oversee Operation Hss, in which 430,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz and executed in just 56 days. The sheer number and volume was so huge that the camp struggled logistically to deal with the genocide, with thousands of bodies being burned in open pits. Hss would then finish his career at Ravensbrück, organising the gassing of prisoners within that camp. He would be arrested in March 1946, despite attempting to bite a cyanide pill, and he would be called to testify at the Nuremberg Trials, being called as a defence witness by the lawyer of Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He would reveal that he estimated 2.5 million were executed at Auschwitz during his time in command of the camp, with the figure representing around 70 to 80% of all those who were sent to the camp. Whilst he was accused of murdering 3.5 million people, he said, "No, only 2.5 million, the rest died from disease and starvation." Hss would be handed over to the Polish authorities, who would try him for murder. Whilst in prison he would write about his experiences, and he would write how he'd been mistreated by the British whilst held in captivity. During his trial he was calm and controlled, and he knew what fate would await him. At the end of the trial he would ask to send his wedding ring to his wife, and the court would announce its verdict, sentencing Hss to death by hanging on April 2nd, 1947. The day after the verdict was passed, former prisoners of Auschwitz would ask the court for the execution of Rudolf Hss to take place on the grounds of his own concentration camp. It was scheduled for the 14th of April, however had to be postponed as it was feared that local residents would attempt to lynch Hss when he was being taken to his site of execution. Instead, the date of his execution was moved back to the 16th of April. The gallows had been made by German prisoners of war, with a trapdoor fitted into it. Hss arrived at Auschwitz for his execution at 8 a.m. and was taken to the building that once housed his office. He asked for a cup of coffee, and after he had finished this he was taken to a cell in Block 11, the death block of Auschwitz. At 10 o'clock he was led out to his execution. He was calm and strolled confidently throughout the camp he had once oversaw, and he walked towards the gallows. His hands were handcuffed and restrained behind his back, and the executioners had to help him climb onto a stool, which the stool had been placed above the trap door. A priest, Father Zaremba, approached Hss, who stood on the stool, and then the prosecutor read out the sentence. The executioner then placed the noose around Hss's neck. Hss then adjusted it with a movement of his head, and then the hangman pulled out the stool from below the former commandant of Auschwitz. His body struck the trap door, which opened, and Hss was left hanging. The priest began to recite a prayer for the condemned and dying. The execution occurred at 10:08 a.m, and at 10:21 he was pronounced dead by a physician. Hss was probably cremated, with his remains being scattered in an unknown location. Hss, 4 days before his execution, would realise the huge crimes he had committed, writing, "As Commandant of Auschwitz, I was responsible for carrying out part of the cruel plans of the Third Reich for human destruction." It was this human destruction that was placed in the forefront of his mind when he came to expand and rule over one of the most inhumane and despicable places on earth, Auschwitz. He was an intensely cruel man, whose crimes and legacy would write him in the history books as one of the most evil men in the history of the Holocaust. Rudolf Hss would finally get his comeuppance in the place in which he inflicted so much horror and suffering onto the world.
Amon Gth was born in Vienna in December 1908, and his family were reasonably wealthy. They owned a publishing house, and it was believed he would later go on to work in the family business, but this would not be the case. Gth had a normal upbringing, and he then went to school to study farming, but he dropped out due to the lure of the Nazis and right-wing politics that took him away from this career. At the time, the Nazi Party was operational in Austria, and it would later then become banned, but Amon Gth joined the local Nazi youth groups, and he also became very anti-Semitic. He joined the Nazi Party as a fully paid-up member in 1931, and he was referred to as an alte Kämpfer, or an old fighter, for the Nazi cause, and Gth was well respected. He would become fully immersed in the Nazi groups including the SA, Hitler's brown shirts, who would disrupt political meetings and would cause chaos with the communists and enemies of the Nazis. They were violent thugs, and Gth was one of these men, and he would later transfer across to the SS, and he stayed in Vienna because he was forced to flee Germany. Gth was wanted for possessing explosives for the Nazi political groups, and he continued to work smuggling weapons into Austria for the Austrian SS, and he would then run goods across the border. He was arrested many times throughout these years, and would even be arrested for being linked to the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, but then Gth would flee justice by being sheltered inside of Dachau concentration camp. He was of course not a prisoner, but instead went to Dachau to train as a concentration camp guard, and this would take him into a camp for the very first time. Amon Gth did try to leave the SS at one point, but following the Anschluss of Austria, he became more indulgent in the Nazi lifestyle, and he would rise throughout the ranks of the group. As the Second World War broke out, he would be based in Poland, and he was a well-respected member within the SS, and was seen as a skilled administrator. He began to work on paperwork for the transportation, deportation, and eventual slaughter of swathes of the Jewish population of Poland, and he would work on establishing ghettos inside of Polish cities. He was later transferred to Lublin to work on Operation Reinhard, the creation of 3 extermination centres, and centres where people were sent where they would be slaughtered within minutes of arriving. Gth would be involved in the roundups of victims before they were then deported, but he was then moved to be involved in the SS Death Heads unit, who would oversee the creation and staffing of the concentration camps. But his first job in the group was to oversee a brand new concentration camp, which became known as Krakow Plaszow, and this camp would become huge. Amon Gth was interviewed for the position of the commandant by Heinrich Himmler, and he got the job, but the camp took 1 month to make. The Nazis would use the site of an old Jewish cemetery to become part of the new camp, and following the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, those prisoners considered fit enough to work were sent to the new camp, and those who were not were slaughtered. When the prisoners arrived at the camp, Amon Gth would speak to the inmates, and he made bold claims and statements, and he said, "I am your God," and he wanted the prisoners to worship him. He was a man who had overall power, however his brutal side came as soon as the camp opened. He was a man who had previously shot over 100 women and children himself during the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, and as more prisoners were sent to his concentration camp, Gth became even more ruthless. He was known for acts of cruelty, and the prisoners were terrified of him. One witness would state that one incident regarding Amon Gth saw him approached by a Jewish lady whose fiancé was cleaning up. She begged the commandant to stay with him, and he refused and told her to turn around, where Gth then pulled out his pistol and shot her dead.
It was said she fell dead, and after that he separated all the people again. Another witness to his brutality stated, "My sister Hella was in a group of women sitting, breaking tombstones into tiny pieces for building roads. Gth appeared and told an older woman she was not doing it right. Gth then showed her how to do it, and then shot the woman." Another former prisoner of Amon Gth's sight would state of him that he was a hideous and terrible monster. He set the fear of death in people, terrified masses, and accounted for much chattering of teeth. He ran the camp through extremes of cruelty that are beyond the comprehension of a compassionate mind, employing tortures which dispatched the victims to hell. For even the slightest rule infraction, he would rain blow after blow upon the face of the helpless offender, would observe with satisfaction born of sadism how the cheek of his victim would swell and turn blue, how the teeth would fall out and the eyes fill with tears. Anyone who was whipped by him was forced to count in a loud voice. Each stroke of the whip, as if he made a mistake, was forced to start counting again. During interrogations he set his dog upon the accused, who was strung up by his legs from a hook in the ceiling. In the event of an escape, he would order the entire group from which the escapee had come to form a row, would then give the order to count to 10, and would then personally kill every 10th person. At one morning parade in the presence of all prisoners he shot a Jew because he complained the man was too tall, and then as the man lay dying he urinated on him. Once he caught a boy who was sick with diarrhea and was unable to restrain himself. Gth then forced him to eat all the excrement and then shot him. The camp he was running epitomised the brutality and evil of the commandant, and it was obvious to anyone that Amon Gth was a horrific and brutal man. The camp itself to begin with only housed 2,000 people, but then when it expanded 25,000 prisoners would be held at one point, and around 150,000 people passed through the barbed wire fences. It was acting as a transit camp, but whilst the camp's conditions were terrible, Gth lived inside of a luxurious villa, and he would sit on the balcony of it and would shoot prisoners with his rifle. If a prisoner saw his hat on the villa's balcony, they knew the shooting would begin, and Gth would shoot the inmates almost as if they were tin cans at a fair. He himself lived very well, and he indulged in banquets and drank very heavily, all whilst the prisoners yards away were starving. He lived very comfortably, even having a Jewish cobbler who made him his own shoes each week. But whilst he was a commandant, between 8,000 and 12,000 prisoners died inside of the camp. The main execution site was nearby and was known as a Hajar Gurkha. But Amon Gth would fly too close to the sun, and his brutal streak would bring him crashing down. He was a man who was even seen as too brutal for the SS, and he would be sacked as a commandant of Krakow-Plaszow, as he was accused of stealing and bringing the SS as an organisation into disrepute. The theft of Jewish property which he was indulging in was against Nazi laws. This took place in September 1944, months before the camp was closed, but because of this, Gth's trial was never heard, as the German war effort was faltering, and his court case was never brought to a courtroom. This ultimately spared him an execution like Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald, who was found guilty of stealing and was then shot inside his own concentration camp. But Amon Gth was described as being mentally ill, and he was locked up in an institution in Bavaria. But he was then arrested by the Americans in May 1945, as to begin with he had avoided the truth that he was a member of the SS, but he was then said to have been recognised by a former prisoner. Because of this, Amon Gth was then brought to trial, and he was sent to Poland to stand trial in the country of his greatest crimes, and his trial took place between the 27th of August and the 5th of September 1946. The courtroom heard of the horrors of his crimes, and evidence came to the forefront about the state of Krakow-Plaszow and how awful Gth was to the other inmates. The courtroom heard of his slaughter of prisoners, and because of this he would be sentenced to death. He was also found guilty of being a Nazi Party member and having ordered torture, imprisonment and extermination. He was also convicted of murder and personally killing, maiming and torturing an unidentified number of people. All of this led to Amon Gth being sentenced to death, and the Polish people considered him one of the most evil war criminals of the Second World War. On the 13th of September 1946, Amon Gth was led out of his prison cell inside of Krakow prison. This was close to the camp where he had overseen. The prison, Montelupich, as it was known, became during the Second World War a place where the Nazis executed many Polish people, but it would be a place where Amon Gth would also lose his life. There was little sympathy for him, and he was taken into the execution courtyard and there was just a stool with a hook and a rope hanging from the gallows. The executioner confirmed his identity before he was placed on top of the stool. Then the noose was placed around his neck, and the stool was quickly kicked out from underneath him. Because of his evil, a Polish guard allegedly then pulled down on his body, slowly strangling him to death. Amon Gth was one of the most despicable and evil war criminals of the Second World War. He would be a man who was more than happy to be complicit in the slaughter and executions of many people. He would inflict a huge amount of suffering and death onto the innocent prisoners inside of his camp. The prisoners realised if they locked eyes with Amon Gth, then they probably would be killed soon after, and for them he would symbolise the devil.
Anton Dostler was born on the 10th of May 1891 in Munich in Germany. It's assumed that he had a rather normal upbringing, but he did sign up to the German military. He joined the army in 1910 and then served his country as a junior officer during the First World War. Little is known about his conduct during World War I, and he returned to life in Germany after the war had come to an end. He remained in the military following the Treaty of Versailles, which stopped Germany having an army of more than 100,000 soldiers. Dostler was part of the Reichsheer, and he must have been highly thought of by Adolf Hitler, also as he was given a senior position inside of the military. From the beginning of the Second World War and the invasion of Poland, he served as the Chief of Staff of the 7th Army. The 7th Army saw service defending the French border region at the beginning of the war, and Dostler was in charge of ensuring that Germany was not invaded by any of the French or Allied armies. Following this role, Dostler was given a commander's position, and he oversaw the 57th Infantry Division between 1941 and 1942. This division saw service inside of Poland, but was then transferred to take part in Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent invasion of the Soviet Union. Dostler acted as a commander of this unit during the early stages of Barbarossa, when the German army was storming through the Soviet Union and taking large amounts of land. He was then transferred yet again to commanding the 163rd Infantry Division in 1942, who were also fighting in the Soviet Union. However, this group saw service in the toughest parts of the Union, fighting close to the Arctic Circle. Anton Dostler then became the commander of the 7th Army Corps, and he was transferred from the Eastern Front to serve inside of Italy, and in particular as the commander of the Venetian coast. It was clear he was a competent general and military leader, but it was whilst in Italy that he committed the war crime that he would pay for with his life. On the 22nd of March 1944, 15 American soldiers, which included 2 officers, landed on the Italian coast. They landed around 15 kilometres north of La Spezia, which was around 400 kilometres behind the front lines. It was part of Operation Ginny 2, a sabotage mission that was conducted during the Italian campaign. The aim was to blow up railway tunnels that would stop communications between the Germans and central Italy. The first attempt failed as the team could not find the tunnel, but a second attempt saw 15 men landing in the wrong place. The men had dressed in proper US Army uniforms and did not have civilian clothing. 3 of them wore paratrooper boots, and they also had their jackets on inside out. They had no markings that indicated they were a branch of the Office of Strategic Services, and they were armed with Colt 45 pistols, fighting knives, and 6 of them had Marlin submachine guns. The objective was to destroy a tunnel between La Spezia and Genoa. It was quickly realised that yet again the team were in the wrong position, and the mission then came one where they would try and hide out. They were to hide during the day, and then establish contact with their PT boats in the night, and then try to carry out the mission. The team hid their rubber boats and explosives to blow the bridge as best as they could, and they found an empty barn on the edge of Carpeneggio. On the 23rd of March, 2 men went to get food, and they approached a farmer who helped them out. But an Italian fisherman noticed that there were rubber boats on the shore, and he mentioned this to the police. 2 fascists went to investigate, and they also found the explosives. They told the local German command detachment, and a search party was assembled that swept the area. Despite the Americans' attempts to hide, all of the 15 soldiers who were inside the barn were captured following a brief skirmish, and they were then taken to the German headquarters of the 135th Fortress Brigade inside La Spezia to be interrogated. 14 of the men did not give up information, but it's believed under torture the one US officer gave over key information that said the commandos were planning to blow up tunnels to disrupt German supplies. The information about the raid was sent to Anton Dostler at the headquarters of the 75th Army Corps, and he then told his superior Field Marshal Albert Kesselring about it and asked what to do with the American men. Kesselring stated that the men should be executed, and Dostler signed the order for the men to be killed. This was after the commando order had been decreed by Hitler, stating that any Allied commando should be executed without proper trial. One of Dostler's aides refused to sign the order, as he knew that those who were being executed were in proper uniform, and this was violating the Geneva Convention, and that the decision to sign the order would come back to bite. This was a smart decision, as it would come back to haunt Dostler. Colonel Olmers of the 135th Fortress Brigade was not happy with the execution order, and he asked Dostler to delay, but in response Dostler ordered that the execution should be carried out. There were attempts made to stop the executions, however ultimately all 15 Americans of the commando raid were executed in the morning of the 26th of March 1944 at Punta Bianca. The men were lined up by the German army on a rocky tip, and then were shot dead and buried in a mass grave that was covered over. This event would be what sentenced Anton Dostler himself to death. After the invasion of Italy, he was captured and was then taken as a prisoner of war by the US Army. They found out what had happened to the commando team, and for this Dostler was implicated in being responsible for their deaths. He was placed on trial on the 8th of May 1945 and was charged with war crimes. His military tribunal was held at the seat of the Supreme Allied Commander in the Royal Palace of Caserta, and with this, it served as the first Allied war crimes trial of World War II. Dostler was accused of carrying out illegal orders that violated the Geneva Convention and resulted in the murders of Allied soldiers. He stated that he had not issued the order and had only passed it along, being a middleman between the colonel carrying out the order and his superior Kesselring. He said that the execution of the soldiers was a lawful order, however, his "I was only following orders given from a superior" defence was not accepted. He also appealed for clemency, and it was said that the executions were in direct violation of Article 2 of the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. It was said no soldier, and still less a commanding general, can be heard to say that he considered the summary shooting of prisoners of war as legitimate, even as a reprisal. With this, Dostler was deemed to have been a war criminal. It was said it was legal to execute spies and saboteurs disguised in civilian clothing or enemy uniform, but not their own uniforms of their own army. As the 15 Americans were dressed in proper US Army uniforms, then they should not have been treated as spies, but as prisoners of war, and with this their lives would have been spared. Because of this, Anton Dostler was found guilty of war crimes and was sentenced to death. His execution was carried out in the Italian city of Aversa, and he was to die as a soldier and face a firing squad. A 12-man group was assembled for the job, and just before 8 a.m. on the 1st of December 1945, Dostler was brought out from his cell to the firing range. At the bottom of it stood a stake where he was secured to. His arms were bound behind his back, and his legs were fastened to the stake. A black hood was then placed over his head, and the order to take aim was given. The firing squad readied themselves, and then fired straight into Anton Dostler, killing him instantly. After his execution, his body was placed onto a stretcher and shrouded in a white cotton mattress cover before he was buried inside a local German war cemetery nearby. So Anton Dostler was a senior member of the German military who was well respected during the Second World War. But what came back to sign his death warrant was the fact his signature was on the piece of paper that sentenced the American men to death. Dostler's order was deemed to have been criminal, and for this he was sentenced to death and executed. He met his end at the same way that those 15 American men did, at a firing range, being stared down by the rifles of those who were there to take his life. Alfred Joseph Ferdinand Jodl was born on the 10th of May 1890 in Bavaria. As a child, it's assumed he had a rather normal family life, and he attended a school in which was linked to the military, and it was clear that Jodl would have a career from this in the army.
He was from a rather affluent family, with his uncle being a psychologist at the prestigious University of Vienna, and his younger brother would also go on to become a general in the army. As the First World War broke out, he was pressed into service on the Western Front, serving in a battery unit. He was there at the very start of the conflict, and despite being wounded in action, he was rewarded with the Iron Cross Second Class. Jodl then returned to the front lines, but was transferred in 1917 across to the Eastern Front, and served here but then returned west. He won the Iron Cross First Class, and following the end of the First World War, he remained within the military. After the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Germany was allowed an army of no more than 100,000 soldiers, greatly minimising the strength and numbers of the army. Alfred Jodl was one of the lucky ones remaining as a soldier in the then labelled Reichswehr, and within this he was a greatly respected and well thought of soldier. Alfred Jodl first saw Adolf Hitler in 1923, when his power was virtually nothing. 3 years earlier, Adolf Hitler had become the Nazi Party's leading public speaker and propagandist, and as time went on, he then increased his stranglehold over the Nazi Party, becoming the leader. It was in 1923 when Hitler attempted to take control of Munich and subsequently be declared the President of Germany in the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Jodl met Hitler before, and he became attracted to the Nazi ideologies and became a staunch supporter. As the 1920s continued and Hitler was released from prison, Jodl continued to help the group gain support, but he also continued his own rise through the ranks of the military. By 1935, he had risen to the rank of Major General. He met with Hitler before the Second World War broke out, and he must have impressed Hitler with his experience in the battlefield. Because of this, he was initially assigned as a commander of the 344th Division after the Anschluss of Austria, in which Austria was absorbed into the German Empire. After this, Jodl was then picked by Hitler to serve as the Chief of Operations Staff for the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW. The OKW was the High Command of the Armed Forces and oversaw the Army, Navy and Air Force. As the conflict continued, it had responsibility for the Second World War on all theatres except the fight against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Alfred Jodl found himself as a deputy to the chief of the OKW, Wilhelm Keitel, a man regarded by many as a yes-man for Hitler, and also found himself as the Chief of Operations Staff. He gained this job shortly before the invasion of Poland took place, and he was integral to the planning of the war and different invasions and operations, with Hitler seeing him as competent and effective. The OKW ran military operations on the Western Front, in Italy and in North Africa, but there was a degree of fragmentation between other groups, such as the Luftwaffe, who established their own command. The OKW would be led by Keitel, who reported to Hitler himself throughout the whole of World War II. Alfred Jodl acted as a leader and a chief of staff during the invasions of Norway and Denmark, making key strategic decisions in regards to these specific operations. Throughout the war, Jodl was confident about the German army and was convinced that the Germans would defeat Britain during the Battle for Britain, and believed an invasion would then take place. One of the biggest elements facing Jodl at the Nuremberg Trials after the war was the fact he signed 2 military orders which were against the rules of war, were unjust and were criminal. Firstly, Jodl signed the Commissar Order on the 6th of June 1941, just before the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa. This order stated that any Soviet political commissar identified amongst captured enemy soldiers would be executed instantly. This order stated that all prisoners Bolshevised or influenced by Bolshevism should also be killed. Hitler, who gave the order, wished to rid Europe of communism and Bolshevism, the key enemies of Nazism. He knew when he issued this that it was illegal, but said that any soldier who carried out an execution or killing would be absolved by Hitler's Nazi Party and would not be held accountable. It stated that immediate and severe measures must be taken. They are therefore, when captured in battle, as a matter of routine, to be dispatched by firearms, indicating that they should be shot. The Commissar Order also stated that anyone with a red star with a golden hammer or sickle on the sleeves should be killed, showing the German army how to identify these specific people. Because of the Commissar Order, thousands of Soviet soldiers who should have been listed as prisoners of war and treated with certain allowances were shot dead when they should have been placed under custody.
The other order Jodl signed was the Commando Order, signed on the 28th of October 1942. This stated that German armed forces should execute and kill all Allied commandos found in Europe and Africa without trial, if they are in uniform or not, and even if they attempt to surrender. This was allegedly issued by the OKW to combat the fact the Allies were allegedly violating the Geneva Convention and that commandos had been ordered to kill German prisoners. The secret order was carried out and said that any commander or officer who refused to carry it out would be punishable under German military law. It resulted in dozens of illegal executions and war crimes. Jodl, signing these orders, virtually signed his own death sentence after the war was over, with both the illegal documents resulting in lots of war crimes. As the conflict continued, he spent time at Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters in East Prussia, and continued to be promoted. During the 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler, when Klaus von Stauffenberg bombed the Wolf's Lair, Jodl was present in the room when the briefcase bomb went off and was injured, suffering a concussion. As the war turned against the Germans following the Normandy invasion and the Battle of Stalingrad, the enemies of the Nazis pushed the Germans back, and defeat was inevitable for Germany. Hitler, whilst Berlin was crumbling around him, shot himself, but instructions were then carried out, appointing Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as the President of Germany. It's clear Dönitz must have respected Jodl, as when he formed his government in Flensburg, Jodl was there and was awarded the Knight's Cross by Dönitz. Jodl probably thought that he had a role in restoring Germany after World War II, and he signed the German surrender on the 7th of May 1945 as a representative of Dönitz, and then a week later when Wilhelm Keitel, his superior, was arrested, Jodl became the chief of the OKW, which was basically pointless with the curtains closing on World War II. Jodl was arrested with the rest of the Flensburg government by the British and was taken to a prisoner of war camp before he was brought to Nuremberg to face war crimes trials. Alfred Jodl was accused of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity, all four of the charges. He was seen as a high-ranking member of the military, and the charges brought before him specifically related to the two illegal orders, the Commissar and the Commando orders, that Jodl signed, saying that those who would be regarded as prisoners of war should be just shot when captured. He was also accused of being complicit in other atrocities, and was presented with evidence about mass shootings of Soviet prisoners of war. He said that the only prisoners shot were those who did not want to walk. More evidence emerged with him being accused of being involved in the unlawful deportation of Jews and others, and also in ordering executions and being complicit in these. His signature was found on an order that sent Danish citizens and Jews to concentration camps, and this was also used against him. Jodl pleaded not guilty, however was found guilty of all four of the charges put forward against him. Because of this, he was sentenced to death and was to be executed in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison by a botching executioner, John C. Woods. On the 16th of October 1946, these executions were carried out. The Nuremberg executions were noted for not going as straightforwardly as they could have done, as the executioner performed his role poorly. Firstly, the trapdoor was too small, and many who fell through smashed their heads on the side, causing bleeding. Also, John C. Woods did not use the same methods as other executioners, and many executions took a number of minutes for the condemned to be killed, slowly strangling to death. In some cases it took between 14 and 28 minutes for the condemned to die, and John C. Woods was noted for even pulling down on one body as the neck had not been broken, strangling a Nazi to death. Alfred Jodl was the 10th of 11 defendants to be executed, however was executed actually 9th, as Hermann Göring had taken his life the evening before. He was led into the gymnasium and was flanked by US soldiers. Inside the gym was a gallows that had been made to perform the deaths, and Jodl was brought in following Fritz Sauckel's death. He was brought into the room shortly before 10 to 3 a.m. in the morning, and he was led up the stairs of the gallows. He was then handed over to John C. Woods, who then asked him for any last words, and Jodl stated, "My greetings to you, my Germany." The hood was then placed over his head, and he was shuffled over the trapdoor before the door was released, and Jodl plunged straight through it.
Judging by the fact that Arthur Sesenquart was executed 9 minutes after Jodl, we can consider that Jodl's execution was one of the more straightforward ones performed that day, with no bleeding being visible on his body or wounds from the trapdoor. Alfred Jodl was incredibly powerful during World War II and was known for being a prominent member of the Nazi High Command. He was a respected military general and leader, and along with Keitel wished to carry out Hitler's demands to invade different lands and build up a huge empire. It was Jodl himself who signed his own death warrant, being complicit in the signing of the commando and commissar orders, and this evidence could not be denied. When he was brought to Nuremberg, the evidence against him was incredibly damning, and later trials would prove that the commissar order was carried out with brutality. A further trial carried out the year later sentenced a number of Wehrmacht officers to prison time for shooting Red Army soldiers and POWs. Alfred Jodl was a key instrument in the Nazi war effort and in Hitler's plans to take different lands and inflict such misery and suffering onto people living there.
Hermann Fegelein was born in Bavaria, and his family were experienced members of the army, and as a young man he worked at an equestrian school, and he would excel in riding horses. This would help him with his career later, due to the fact he would become a cavalry soldier. Following a short period of time studying at university, Fegelein joined the cavalry regiment, and he would also join the state police in Bavaria, but he left the police service as he was caught cheating in an exam. But he joined the Nazi Party in 1930, then 3 years later he would become an SS man, and he would work as a teacher inside of an SS-based equestrian unit, but he would be promoted a number of times within Heinrich Himmler's evil organisation. He was also in charge of the creation and upkeep of the facilities for the horse events in the Berlin Olympics, and he was now rubbing shoulders with rather senior Nazis. He did even try to be a part of the Olympic team, but he was not good enough. Himmler would continue to promote Hermann Fegelein, and he continued to work with horses inside the SS, but as the Second World War broke out, he would be placed in command of the SS Death Heads Horse Regiment in Poland. The unit was controlled by the Ordnungspolizei, and it was split into small groups to help the police in occupied countries. But the regiment would be expanded and enlarged, and the training was rather vigorous. But Fegelein was an ardent Nazi, and his unit would be involved in war crimes, and inside of the Campinos forest he would shoot 1,700 people, and these would be executed and then interred in a mass grave. But Fegelein then began to command part of the unit, but his group was short on supplies such as weapons and food, and many soldiers became ill. There was also theft in the unit, and many believed Fegelein's men were bandits. He himself was brought to a court-martial as he was charged with stealing money and valuable items which had been taken from Jews and were being sent back to Germany and were classed as Nazi property. But Himmler stepped in on his behalf and stopped this court-martial, and Fegelein continued to rampage across Poland. Inside of the Gestapo prison in Warsaw, he would order arrests and executions in the Polish city, and he would assault on a large scale. Every time prominent Nazis would investigate his behaviour though, Himmler would step in and stop this going any further. But he continued to rise throughout the ranks, and at the start of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, Fegelein was on the front lines on the Eastern Front. His units were charged with covering the gaps in the advancing German lines, but his unit were very quick, to the point where the tanks could not keep up. His horses were exhausted, and the men were taken to the front line in lorries as Fegelein had pushed them too hard. His unit would be involved in reconnaissance missions, but Fegelein's men fought heavily, and many of them, including he, were awarded the Iron Cross. At the time though, there was a difference between the old form of warfare, using horses, and the new, using vehicles, and Fegelein still believed horses had an important role on the battlefield. But Himmler would then assign the soldiers with a special mission, and they would comb and search the Pripyat swamps, looking for Jews who were rounded up for execution. They shot many more civilians also, and the instruction was to cleanse the area of partisans and Jews. Any enemy soldiers in uniform were to be taken prisoner, and those not in uniform were to be shot. Fegelein's men slaughtered and executed many people who were hiding out, and he was even told by Himmler that the numbers of civilians he had killed were too low. This meant that he had to go further, and he was ordered by Himmler to shoot any Jew who was over the age of 14. Women and children were ordered to be driven into the swamp and to be drowned.
Fegelein's units were one of the first of the Holocaust to wipe out whole Jewish communities, and they noted that the swamp was too shallow, so they just shot women and children also. He would write to Himmler that his detachment had shot 14,178 Jews, 1,001 partisans, 699 Red Army soldiers, with only 830 prisoners taken. Others believe that the number executed was actually close to 24,000 inside of the swamps. Fegelein had established a reputation for being a barbaric war criminal, and he was a man who was trusted by Himmler. He was then used in the offensive towards Moscow as the German army advanced, and he was later given command of Kampfgruppe Fegelein, but on the 22nd of December 1942 he was hit by sniper fire and was wounded. He returned to the battlefield as the commander of the 8th SS Cavalry Division, and his unit were involved in executing partisans. He would himself in one attack blow up a bunker, and the unit had caused chaos, destroying over 60 villages, leaving a smear of execution and looting on the landscape. His division continued to fight on the Eastern Front campaigns, and he again was wounded in September 1943. But around this time he was then assigned to become part of Hitler's headquarters staff, and he would also act as a liaison officer and representative of the SS. He was the mouthpiece of Himmler at briefings with Hitler, and he would even be present when the July 20th bomb went off inside of the Wolf's Lair headquarters. But Fegelein was a man who was motivated for more power and influence. He was completely power-mad, and he would, because of this, marry Gretel Braun, the sister of Eva Braun, Adolf Hitler's then-girlfriend and future wife. Their marriage occurred on the 3rd of June 1944 in Salzburg, and he knew that this marriage for him was a way to establish more power and a seat at the table with the Nazi bigwigs. Gretel was not known for her looks, but Fegelein was known for being a ladies' man and a playboy who had many different affairs with other women. He would even capture the eye of his sister-in-law, Hitler's girlfriend Eva, as he would dance with her, and the pair would flirt. Eva Braun was very fond of Hermann Fegelein, and she may have admired his looks and personality. The marriage of the pair was huge, and it was a big celebration, with Hitler, Himmler and Martin Bormann acting as witnesses. But despite the event, the war effort was already beginning to turn against the Nazis and the Germans. With this, many high-ranking Nazis tried to save their skin. Fegelein's great friend Heinrich Himmler had a breakdown, and he was inside of a sanatorium trying to save his skin by doing deals with the Allies, and he was trying to negotiate peace. But Fegelein was still inside the Führer bunker until nearly the very end. Berlin would be cut off from the rest of Germany at the end of April 1945, and Hitler had received news that Himmler was trying to do deals with the enemies of the Nazis, and with this he was completely furious. He then ordered Peter Hergel to go and find Fegelein, who had already abandoned the bunker, as he did not want to die inside the underground complex. Fegelein then was found in his Berlin apartment, attempting to flee and cross the border, and he was carrying cash and documents regarding Himmler's negotiations. Hitler then ordered Fegelein to be stripped of all his ranks and to be sent to the front line, but they knew he would then run away again. Fegelein's wife was at the time pregnant, and Hitler did consider releasing him, and Eva Braun tried to plead for his life. But Hitler then ordered Fegelein's execution, and when he was taken to the Führer bunker, he was drunk and not in a fit state at all. He was then taken out of the bunker and into the garden of the Reich Chancellery on the 28th of April. It was said that when he was taken out of the bunker, he was crying and weeping, and was so drunk he was being sick, and he could hardly stand up. Because of this, a member of the SD allegedly then went up behind him, sneakily, and with one gunshot shot him in the head from behind, instantly killing Hermann Fegelein. An eyewitness would later claim that he knew who Fegelein's killer was, but he refused to name this specific executioner. Hermann Fegelein had a rather strange end to his life. He was a man who was a despicable Nazi war criminal, and he was a man who would be responsible for thousands of executions during World War II. He was a man who was greatly trusted and greatly liked by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, but he sought to try and save himself at the end of the conflict. Fegelein, as mentioned, was described as one of the most disgusting Nazis, and he was obsessed with power, and he would marry Hitler's sister-in-law for the influence. But Fegelein's execution was a shocking one, as he was a crying, drunken mess when an executioner came up behind him in the crumbling ruins of Berlin with his pistol.